Morning, everyone. Welcome to our Growing Together webinar today. Happy to see all of you. We appreciate this. We hope you appreciate this format for learning more about peanuts and interacting with peanut industry colleagues. This morning, we have an exciting seminar to present, but before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, keep your microphones on mute during the presentation, which prevents distractions and feedback. And after the presentation, Dr. Sterling has kindly agreed to answer questions, so you can unmute your microphone at that time, use the raise hand feature if you would like, or you can also type questions into the chat and we'll get to them that way. As I said, this morning we are delighted to have Dr. Samara Sterling of the Peanut Institute with us. She will be presenting information about a recent study connecting peanuts with brain health, which is a new area of study and very exciting for the industry. Dr. Samara Sterling is a nutrition scientist and research director for the Peanut Institute. She has expertise in the use of plant-based nutrition for the prevention and treatment of chronic diseases. And in her role, Dr. Sterling manages the research funded by the Peanut Institute and industry partners and develops studies aims surrounding peanut nutrition, such as this one. She also functions as principal investigator and director for clinical nutrition and lifestyle interventions, examining strategies to improve health in at-risk communities. Dr. Sterling has served as a nutrition consultant for various community-based research projects and sits on the external advisory board for USAID's Peanut Innovation Lab. She regularly speaks for both national and international audiences and is passionate about translating science into consumer-friendly messages. Dr. Sterling holds a bachelor's degree from Stony Brook University, master's degree from Andrews University, and a PhD from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And welcome, Samara. We'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks to all for joining us for this webinar. This is an topic that I think is something that we can all be excited about as a peanut industry. So I'm just going to get right into it. I'm going to share my screen here. And this webinar is going to be a little bit different. If you've heard me talk about this particular study, we are going to go through the study step by step so we understand what happened, the background of it, so that we can have a clearer understanding of the actual results. Here's a bit of the outline here. I'll talk about the background and rationale, give you an idea of the study location, the team that conducted this study, the design of the study, of course, the results, talk about maybe why we saw some of the results that we saw, and then implications for future research. So let's talk about the background and rationale. So when we look at cognitive and mental health disorders and emotional disorders, they are becoming an increasing burden on our society. So as nutrition scientists, this has been something that we have been, and just scientists in general, neuroscientists as well, something that we've been thinking about for quite a while, because we see that diseases like Alzheimer's disease are still among the top 10 causes of death each year. And in fact, this statistic was staggering to me. More than 16 million people in the US are living with some form of cognitive impairment. And that number may be underestimated because some may not even know it yet, because typically it's not until you get to an advanced stage or a more moderate stage that that's even been diagnosed. But even that number there is twice the population of New York City. So that's a staggering statistic. And we know that it's affecting us at younger ages. The face of cognitive disorders, that's changing. Many of you may have seen the news last month with Bruce Willis, who was recently diagnosed with aphasia. And of course, that is a brain disorder that can be considered a type of cognitive disorder because it affects the language center in the brain, the ability for the brain to produce and understand language. He hasn't said if he had a stroke, but that is one of the most common causes of that disease. So we're seeing that face changing of cognitive disorders. So it's really something that we ought to think about. In addition to that, mental health is also something that we're seeing on the rise. Interestingly, before the pandemic hit, just from January to June 2019, 1 in 10 adults reported having regularly having anxiety and depressive symptoms. During the pandemic, that number skyrocketed to 40% of us. And when we look at where the largest share of that is, it's made up of younger adults, 18 to 24 years old. It does affect us at all ages, but this is just sort of where the largest share is. And we are currently looking, when we see the surveys, this one is from Kaiser Family Foundation, more and more people are saying that the pandemic is changing the way they eat and prepare food. They want to know how food affects various areas of health, including cognitive and mental health. So what exactly causes cognitive and mental impairment? Well, there are a few factors, and I'll say that we don't understand all of the factors just yet, but the main ones, genetic factors, which, that's something that it's an external one that we can't do too much about. However, we do know that there are other modifiable risk factors that we can use to affect the genetic factors. There's also environmental factors, early life stressors, as well as lifestyle factors, including diet. If you look at that cartoon there on the left, I know it's pretty busy, but what you'll see, that one is from the article on the bottom there, but what you'll see is that when it comes on to how foods and certain polyphenols or antioxidants affect the brain, many of them, the wrong types of foods, so to speak, can increase inflammation. And these compounds are called pro-inflammatory cytokines. This inflammation can enter into the brain and change the basic structure, cause that neuroinflammation, and that structure can then affect the functionality of the brain. And so a lot of times when we do these cognitive studies, we are looking at these inflammatory cytokines. You may notice some of them for those of you who are scientists on the call. So looking at how food affects the brain, we know that food is to the brain what electricity is to a computer. We can think of it sort of like that, because food powers the brain. It creates and powers neurons, and neurons are really those chemicals that transmit information to and from the brain. It's what lets our brain know what we need to do next. The second thing is that food helps our brain facilitate and store memory, and it also helps our brain process and use data that's coming in. The other way in which we know that food affects the brain is because we saw, now when we started thinking about whether or not we should enter this space as the peanut industry, looking into how peanuts and peanut butter can affect brain health, it made sense rationally because we know how powerful peanut and peanut butter consumption are for heart health and the function of our blood vessels. And because we knew that, we also know that the connection between the heart and brain are very much intricate. So those blood vessels that bring blood to and from the heart, they're very intricately connected to the brain. And so if we could see an improvement in vascular function as it relates to the heart, we thought it's plausible that we may also see improved vascular function when it comes on to the brain as well. Another clue that we had was that we also know that food affects the gut bacteria, the gut microbiome. So the bacteria that lives within our gut, our foods can change that. And specifically, one of those components is the fiber within foods. These fibers are turned into compounds that we call short chain fatty acids. And these short chain fatty acids, research has shown that they may be able to protect both the heart and the brain. So we knew that peanuts are a great source of fiber. We also knew that peanuts, that fiber is also metabolized into short chain fatty acids. So we thought that that was another clue. Here's another clue that we had, and you may have heard me talking about this. I've been talking about this since 2018, based on some research that we were seeing in this particular polyphenol called p-cumaric acid. There was some early research, and it's basic research, so you really have to dig within the literature to find it. But this is an antioxidant that we find in peanuts, some other plant foods. There aren't many polyphenol databases, but the one that we see from, it's somewhere in the UK, I believe, the polyphenol database that is out right now, it lists p-cumaric acid as highest in peanuts compared to other nuts. The only other nut that it lists there is walnuts. Now, it may be in other foods. We don't necessarily know the amounts of other foods. I'm sure it's in other plant foods as well, but just based on what this database has recorded, it's pretty high in peanuts. And we saw from previous research that this particular polyphenol is able to target a specific neurotransmitter in the brain called GABA. If you've heard of GABA, you know GABA is responsible for regulating mood and anxiety. And so there were quite a few studies that showed that it may be a safe and effective alternative for helping to reduce stress and anxiety in humans. So that was another clue that we had there. So when it came on to doing this study, we connected with Dr. Rosa Lamuela Raventos in January 2019, based on some previous work that she had done in the nut space. And obviously, we discussed a lot of great ideas. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes in our grant process as we talk to various researchers about some ideas surrounding mechanisms for the studies that they're looking into. Dr. Raventos was an investigator on the PREDIMED trial. This is where we get the Mediterranean diet from. And she is a professor at the University of Barcelona. So very well-respected researcher there. And just in case you're unfamiliar with the University of Barcelona in Spain, it is the #1 university in Spain, number 35 in Europe, and number 96 globally. So really good university, and we were fortunate to work with some top researchers there. And then another thing that we considered was when we looked at the nuts and dried foods statistical yearbook, just from 2018 to 2019, we saw that there was a correlation between the 3 nuts that were used in the Mediterranean diet study and the nuts that were popular for consumption in Spain. And so it's always a tricky balance to find, because obviously at the Peanut Institute, we are focused on nutrition. And so thinking about the interplay there between what the research says and how that might affect demand, that's something I think is bigger than us. It's something that's an industry-wide effort, but we did see this clue there that we wanted to maximize on. Okay, so study design. How did we design this study? Well, the study was designed with 3 arms. It was not blinded. I'll tell you why, because it's a little bit hard to blind studies with peanuts, just because peanuts have a very distinct taste. So typically folks will know if they're consuming peanuts or not. So we're still sort of working around how we can blind a study that includes peanuts. We have a couple of options that we think about, but we're not quite there yet. 63 young, healthy college students, mostly college students between the ages of 18 to 33. They were divided into 3 groups. One group had about an ounce of dry roasted peanuts each day, and that was dry roasted peanuts with skins, peanut butter, about a serving of peanut butter there, and then a control butter that did not include either peanuts or peanut butter. They could not consume red wine or chocolate or other nuts. The reason is that these other foods have some of the antioxidants that we wanted to make sure that we were looking at, so we excluded those from the diet as well. They were tested at baseline or 0 months, halfway through the study at 3 months, and then at the end of the study at 6 months, we also looked at outcomes there. What were the main outcomes that we were looking at for this study? Number 1, the effect of peanut and peanut butter intake on cognitive outcomes. And then secondary outcome was the effect of peanut and peanut butter intake on mental health outcomes. Some of the domains that were tested here, because when we think of cognition, sometimes we just think of that as, oh, just your brain. So what exactly is cognition? How we think and process and learn information. You can see that that cartoon there on the bottom, perceiving and reasoning and learning and evaluating and remembering. You know, a lot of times we don't think about the role that food may be able to. I mean, who would think that food might be able to affect how I learn something? You know, that just seems very arbitrary. But the cognitive spaces, we're really looking at these specific centers in the brain and looking at how food can target that. And specifically in this case, of course, peanuts and peanut butter. So in this study, we were looking at memory, so your short-term memory and then delayed memory. Also executive function, so a person's ability to set goals and plan and execute, for example, a project, a science project at school. And then processing speed, so how long it takes our brains to process and react to information that's coming in. You can see that all of these domains are important for college students, and not even just college students as we get older, but specifically within this age group, you're thinking about projects and tests and, doing all these things that are required for college exam to college homeworks and assignments, these domains are super important for that. And as we get older in life, they also remain very important. Some of the other measurements that we took: clinical, biological, and some surveys. Under the clinical, this is standard for most human nutrition studies, anthropometric measurements. So your BMI, your waist circumference, your lipids, your glucose, your blood pressure. Two unique measurements that we did take clinically was urinary cortisol and inflammation. Cortisol is well known as a stress hormone, so we wanted to measure that biologically. And then inflammation, just like that picture I showed you in the beginning, where we saw the inflammatory cytokines, we wanted to look at that as well. Biologically, the researchers extracted polyphenols from the actual test products and then correlated that with the dietary intake to make an estimation as to how that polyphenol or antioxidant intake was happening. They also extracted short chain fatty acids from feces. I know probably not the most fun thing to do in a human nutrition study, but hey, it helps us get the results. So kind of got to do what we got to do, right? And then they also quantified, I'll talk about these very long chain saturated fatty acids. They also quantified that in plasma and feces. So stick a pin there in your mind. I'll discuss them a little bit later on. And then we also took some surveys on mental health and mood, food intake, physical activity, and then of course, polyphenol intake or antioxidant intake. Just showing a couple pictures here as to how they were being used. So they did have to eat a serving of peanuts or serving of peanut butter each day, but however they got it down, it didn't matter. We just, anywhere throughout the day, they could use it within their dietary pattern. And it was fun to see how they were incorporating peanuts into their Mediterranean diet pattern that they were already used to. So that was pretty cool. Okay, so the results, what did we see in this study? The clinical measurements, because that's the first thing that I talked about, so I'll just say here, the clinical measurements, we actually saw nothing in the clinical measurements, but there's a good reason for that. Reason for that is because we had healthy college students. So their average BMI at baseline was normal, 22, overweight category is above 25, and then obese is over 30. So we had average BMI at baseline. So we didn't see that change at 6 months at all, which is a good thing, right? Because that weight management continued to be stable, even though physical activity decreased by the end of the intervention. So that's actually a good thing. Average blood pressure, we also didn't see that change. Again, blood pressure was normal, 110/70. Anything below 120/80 is normal. So we didn't see that change. No changes in blood glucose or blood lipids. But of course, we report on that just to kind of say what we saw there, no changes, and that's a good thing. As far as the biological measurements of what we saw, I'm going to show you a few tables, and they may look a little busy, but I'll kind of just explain and walk you through what we're seeing here. That highlighted area looked at the polyphenol intake of resveratrol, which is an antioxidant, and then p-cumaric acid, other cumaric acids which are related to p-cumaric acid, those polyphenols there. What they did see was that the peanut and peanut butter group had significantly higher intakes of all of these polyphenols compared to baseline. Interestingly, the control group, their intake of these antioxidants decreased. So yes, we took out the red wine, we took out the chocolate, and they were eating peanuts, but even with intake of other foods that they may have been eating, we still saw the decrease in intake of these specific antioxidants. And this is one of the main reasons that researchers were able to kind of correlate these antioxidants to the results that we saw. Second thing that we saw, the short chain fatty acids. Remember, I talked about the gut bacteria and producing those short chain fatty acids. That was also increased in both the peanut and the peanut butter group. So we know that something significant was going on in terms of changes in the gut microbiome. And as I mentioned before, we've seen previous research that these short chain fatty acids are able to target the brain and are possibly able to improve cognition. So that was a really good sign. We did not see that happen in the control group. The third thing that we saw, these very long chain saturated fatty acids that I'm going to explain a little bit later. We saw that increase mostly in the peanut butter group, some in the peanut group. we did see a little bit of increase in the control group, but that was because the control butter did contain a little bit of peanut oil. So we're not surprised that we saw that there. However, that was actually a really important or significant point that we saw in the study. So how did these affect the brain? All of these measures that we saw. Well, what we saw for both peanuts and peanut butter, there was better short-term verbal memory. For peanut butter, there was better total verbal memory and better total memory in general. And then lower anxiety scores, lower depression scores. What does that have to do with college students? Well, we have research that shows that short-term memory actually helps with both reading proficiency and mathematical abilities. And we also know that higher levels of anxiety and depression are associated with lower academic performance. So seeing that is sort of a secondary benefit of including both peanuts and peanut butter, or either or. We were able to see the specific differences between the two. We also saw, because remember I said that we measured cortisol in this study as well. So we also saw a decrease in cortisol in the urine. And you can see from this graph here, the stars indicate where the significance was, statistical significance. Anything below 0.05 is what we call statistically significant. The control butter, when compared to the control butter, you can see the skin roasted peanuts, or dry roasted peanuts. You can see that decrease in cortisol, which indicates a decrease in stress. Same thing for the peanut butter group, a decrease there. I know you may be looking at the control butter and saying, well, I see a little bit of that decrease, but from a statistical standpoint, that actually was not significant at all. It was a more significant drop for both the peanuts and the peanut butter. And the reason this is significant is because anybody can say, well, I don't feel stressed when I'm eating a certain food item, but it wasn't just about that. The body was actually telling us what it was during that time and saying, hey, biochemically, I have less cortisol when I eat peanuts or peanut butter. So I think that's really significant. Impact there, we know that stress in student has been associated with lower GPA, and it's also associated with increased risk of school dropout and decreased motivation. So again, this plays very well into academic performance. So why did we see these results? There are 3 compounds that we were able to correlate specifically with each of the benefits that we saw with peanut consumption. Number 1 was the polyphenols, especially the p-cumaric acid. That was correlated with lower anxiety, lower stress, lower depression. The short chain fatty acids were correlated specifically with lowering stress and depression. So it means that they were somehow able to target these centers within the brain. And then the very long chain saturated fats were correlated with stress, anxiety, and memory, actually better memory through that. Now for the very long chain saturated fats. Reason this is really important is because, you know, we typically hear that saturated fats are bad for heart health. Saturated fats, get away from saturated fats. And while that's true, there are foods that contain a small amount of very long chain saturated fat. So they have 20 carbons or more. What this tells us is that not all saturated fats are created equally. There's actually research that's showing that foods that contain a really small amount of that, these are not insignificant compounds, but they may actually play a vital role in protecting health. Like this study from Harvard University followed over 2,000 adults and looked at carotid artery plaques from baseline, followed them for 7 years. And what they found was that there was a significant relationship between intake of these very long chain saturated fatty acids and heart health. So people who ate a little bit more of these, they had less coronary artery plaques. And this was specifically in women. And so the authors concluded there lower risk for cardiovascular disease and even lower risk for diabetes with very long chain saturated fats in the diet. So that's something that is really cool in my mind that I think that we'll start to see more research on in the future. What we saw here was that these results aligned with other studies. We saw a 2017 randomized control trial that showed that eating peanuts enhanced cerebrovascular function, so that vascular function, the elasticity of the blood vessels, as well as cognitive function. specifically verbal fluency and processing speed increased in that study. And then we had another study that was done out of Russell Sage University that showed that adults who did not consume peanuts or peanut butter were 30 to 50% more likely to do poorly on cognitive tests that had to do with word learning, processing speed, and attention than those who did. So the results that we saw here really confirmed other studies. And as I mentioned Bruce Willis in the beginning, and I talked about stroke, there is another study that showed that, and this was done in mice, so of course we need more study on that in humans. Not sure how you would study that in humans, but p-cumaric acid was able to help to prevent injury after a stroke and tissue damage that can affect cognitive capabilities. So as I wrap up here, as I'm looking at my time, what are the implications for future research? Well, let's talk about the strengths and limitations, because every study has its strengths, every study has its limitations. The strength for this is that it was a randomized control trial. This is the gold standard of nutrition science research because it helps us to really identify where the associations are that we're seeing. So I think the study was well designed. The length of time that participants were studied were also a strength. The previous study that I mentioned from 2017, that was a 12-week study. This was a 6-month study. So we had time to see the results, and we were testing them at 3 months and then at 6 months. It was also done in young, healthy individuals. And we also know from research that it's harder to see changes in healthy individuals. It's harder to see health changes if you're already healthy. So to be able to see these small but significant changes is something that I think is really good. Limitations, talked about this before, the study was not blinded. We did have a relatively small sample size, 63, but I wouldn't say that I think that it's still significant, not too small of a sample size. We did have some minor COVID disruptions, but the researchers were able to really pivot around that. So the study extended to 7 months instead of 6 because of those disruptions. We do need future studies to confirm the results being conducted in different populations and in larger groups. So areas of future study, looking at, for example, what other areas of the brain might be affected by peanuts and what other neural hormones might be affected. We're just scratching the surface on this. And no, I sound excited whenever I talk about this because I am, because I think that this is something that all of us in the peanut industry can really get excited about, because as we are scratching the surface of this science, it's really groundbreaking. And I think what we can see in the future is something that's exciting. So looking at these neurohormones like serotonin or melatonin that have to do with stress and sleep response, neural inflammation, and even autism. We actually have a basic study going on that right now. Understanding more of these very long chain saturated fats and what role they play in the heart and the brain. Healthy aging, so not just for college students, but how does, if we eat peanuts long-term and peanut butter long-term, how does it even change the structure and function of our brain as we get older to help to reduce risk like Alzheimer's and other dementias? And then p-cumaric acid and the other cumaric acid, looking at being able to quantify the levels in peanuts and look at maybe what some of those other functions may be. So in conclusion, and I'm 1 minute over, healthy young adults who consumed peanuts or peanut butter for 6 months showed an improvement in memory and lower scores for anxiety, stress, and depression. And these results suggest that regular intake of peanuts and peanut butter can positively affect both cognitive and mental health. So that's all I have there. There's my phone number, there's my email address, but we are here online and I'm happy to take any questions that may have popped up.
Thank you, Samara. That was fascinating. Fascinating. I felt like we rushed you. So much to unpack there. I have a question, which seemed kind of obvious to me, but it looks like from the study that the students ate both peanuts and peanut butter, or did some eat some and some eat another? Did you compare the differences between peanuts and peanut butter, or were they kind of lumped together?
No, they weren't lumped together. And that was actually one of the other strengths of this study. We did 3 arms. So one ate peanuts, the other ate peanut butter, and then the other the control butter, so that we can see where the differences really were between the two. And we saw that both had some really good results.
Chris Butts responded in the chat. Will he finally understand genomics if he eats more peanuts and peanut butter? And I think the answer to that question is yes, but.
Oh, well, I hope so. I hope we all may be able to understand a lot more things by eating more peanuts and peanut butter. So hopefully, Chris.
Samara, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the peanuts that that arm ate was they had the skins on them. Do you think this information would apply to peanuts without them?
Good question. Yes. So yes, there's a qualified yes to that. So the skins, the reason the skins were included is because the skins do have those, they really do have a high concentration of those polyphenols that we were talking about. So like the p-coumaric acid, resveratrol is in the skins, and then we also have some fiber in the skins, which will lead to the short chain fatty acids that we talked about with the gut bacteria. So that's the reason it was included. But in other studies, so for example, the Russell Sage study, that was not something that was specific with peanuts with skins, or the 2017 study. So I do think from the research that we would see those results, and we have been seeing those results. It's just that the skins is sort of an added benefit, so to speak.
We have a comment in the chat, which isn't really a question, but just for those of you who are listening to the webinar this morning, there was a press release that was sent out right after the study was released in Europe, and it received wide and extensive coverage. And I think that shows that there's a lot of interest in the nutrition world on this topic. It's unique, it's interesting, and I think there's a lot of, like Samara said at the end, a lot of things we still need to uncover here. When we mentioned your bio, we talked about you serving Dr. Sterling on the UGA's Peanut Innovation Lab. Would you mind just sharing with this group, since we have them as a captive audience, would you mind sharing with them just a teeny bit about the study that is being conducted in Ghana, also on cognitive benefits? I know you don't know a huge amount about it, but
yeah,
maybe you could share just a minute.
Sure. We reviewed that study, I would say, maybe 3 years ago. So some of the details might escape me, but this study is being done in school children in Ghana, and they're going to be looking at, or they're continuing to look at, a peanut-based food item, and I believe they're using a paste, and they're creating some other food item, and they're going to be correlating that with the cognitive performance of the students there. These aren't college students, they're elementary age students. So that'll be good, because that's also looking at a separate population under very different circumstances, and then a very different age group as well. So I think that will only lend to sort of strengthen the evidence that we have in this area.
Hopefully. And to that end, there's another question in the chat. Are there plans to fund further research on peanuts and brain health to strengthen the claims from this study?
Definitely. That is one of our top aims. And we have a few other studies that are going on right now in this area. I mentioned autism. We actually have one at Harvard University. It's basic, but it's looking at how the oils in peanuts might be able to target certain centers that have to do with autism. It's being used in mice right now. So that's an earlier one. We have one at the University of Delaware that's looking at adults with hypertension or high blood pressure, because that constricts the blood vessels, and looking at how peanuts and peanut butter can change cognitive function there. And then we also have another one at Loma Linda University that's actually going to be, right now, they are taking pictures, so to speak, of these various centers in the brain, so that we can see, just in simplistic terms, what areas light up when you consume peanuts, so you can actually have that visual there. So yes, we are continuing to do more research in this area. I think we need to do that in order to strengthen the evidence.
You're reading that question in the chat.
I am. Yeah. Okay. So Brad, could a layman's one pager that we could share with the trade? Sure. And I think Miriam's listening in, but think we have something on this that we can probably send you. So if you put your email there, we can probably send you something for sure.
Yeah, and a plug for the Peanut Institute. If you all don't know, there are a series of infographics and other materials on the website. And then infographic. Do we have an infographic on brain health?
Yes, we have a couple infographics on brain health, and we actually have a video on brain health too. So
those
you
are
check
tools
that out on our website. Yes. And I'm going to type our website in the chat so that for those of you who are not familiar.
Yeah, lots of good stuff there. Lots of resources to use for working with consumers and all kinds of people. You know, I guess I have a question. You listed it as a weakness of that study, but a COVID disruption, COVID disruptions. But do you think maybe some of those students might have been even more stressed than usual because of COVID? And maybe that could also be sort of a strength of this study.
Definitely.
During a stressful period, that still reduced cortisol.
Yeah, definitely. And even, I mean, compared to the control group, right? Because you're right, because their stress levels may have subconsciously increased, and also, I may have to look back at the data again, but their stress levels, even in the control group, may have even increased. And also, we know that they weren't exercising. Cortisol levels increase when you're not exercising. So that's also an important piece there, that even though the exercise wasn't there, cortisol levels were still dropping.
Anybody else have a question? And feel free to turn your camera on and unmute yourself and just ask if you prefer not to type. I guess you nailed it, Samara.
And we see all your comments in the chat. Thank you all. And I think, again, it's when I think about this topic, I think it's something, I always think about our nutrition message as something that we can all take with us. It's something that unites us because, and of course, there are many other messages that unite us, but everybody has to eat, right? We all eat. It's not something that we have a choice about. Yeah, we can choose not to, but we all eat. And so there's interest around what we eat more and more, even now throughout COVID. So having these tidbits and these messages that we can say are evidence-based, not just us saying we experience it for ourselves, but we actually have the data to show for it, is something that we can all rally behind and be excited about. So I appreciate everybody coming out and listening, and hopefully you have some messages that you can take to your specific areas and be able to share that with others too.
So thank you very much, Samara. Thank you all for joining us today. If anybody has any ideas or interest in future Growing Together webinars, please let us, either Christina or I know by email. We'd appreciate that information too. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.